All right, that was a little closer to 30 seconds, but we'll go ahead and get started here. I know we're 1 minute after noon Eastern time. So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Tag Inspector webinar here today on playing in the Privacy Sandbox. We're going to go through some core principles and then some preparation for the future as it relates to the cookieless world and a lot of those changes that are happening within the digital ecosystem. Before we kind of fully dive into everything, a little bit of context. So who we are, who I am, why it is that I'm having this conversation with you today. So my name is Lucas. I am our product manager for Tag Inspector. Tag Inspector is a product of InfoTrust, which is the organization many of you are likely familiar with. So on the InfoTrust side of the house, we do data governance, consulting work, as well as really everything end to end, everything that has to do with data collection, architecture, and then also actioning of any of that first party data. So we are Google marketing platform sales partners, as well as Google Cloud Platform certified consulting partners. It's a mouthful. And so, yeah, so we work a lot with the Google stack in general, as well as all sources of first-party data, as well as data governance and privacy. So that's kind of where I work, at the intersection of all of those different things. And I've been doing a lot of work really digging into the different Privacy Sandbox proposals and chatting with a number of our partners on all things cookieless world and these different changes that are upcoming. So hopefully here today, we can really simplify some of these different concepts for you, read some of those tea leaves, and make some predictions for the future. A lot of things are in flux right now, but hopefully this can give us some ideas about where to begin taking steps and taking measures to reach some of our goals here in the future, even given that uncertainty. As far as the agenda here today, first, I want to just quickly go through how we got here, just so everyone, we're on the same page. We'll go through a cookies overview, again, just so that we all know that we're talking about the same things and we're all using the same language. We'll then walk through a few of the core proposals that are within the Privacy Sandbox for Chrome specifically. Kind of talk through what the implications are, some of the common themes, and then from there, we'll go through those general themes and then some recommendations for actions that you can be taking now in order to be able to prepare for where we'll end up next year. At the end, we'll go through just a summary and general Q&A. I always do, though, recommend and request, if you have questions as we're going through this, that's why we do live webinars. Drop them in the questions pane. There's the Q&A pane there within the Zoom webinar panel. If it's right there as we're going through a particular topic and it's relevant for that particular section, I'm more than happy to dig into some of those questions and try to provide those answers really in a live fashion as we're going through. So with that, we can get started and hopefully this can be helpful for everyone here today. So first thing I want to cover and what I'd like to really go through is how we got here. So I really enjoy using these visuals. They're from our Tag Inspector platform, but what they do is they show for a particular website, and I always close off exactly what that website is, but it's a media publishing website, and this visual gives us an idea of all of the various different third-party marketing and advertising platforms that are loading across this website over the years and then how they're being introduced there. So when we look back in 2014, this particular website had 13 tags that were deployed on that particular domain. 2015, we see about a twofold increase with a little over 30 tags, so 34 total tags. And we're starting to see some more piggybacking behavior. So tags that are injecting other tags, some of that cookie matching going on, more information being collected about users and being shared with various different partners. 2016, we're continuing to see that progression with 53 different tags and a very large increase in that piggybacking behavior. So more tag behavior, more data collection, more cookies being placed by various different platforms that even this website likely did not have visibility into. We then look at 2017, 60 tags, the depth of that piggybacking behavior happening even more. And then finally, 2018, exponential increase, 164 various different unique platforms that are placing cookies, creating profiles of users on this particular website. So we could see, and we asked the question, how did we get here? And oftentimes we like to think that, these things are meant to make marketing more difficult or meant to make advertising more difficult, but it's exactly because of behavior like this and just the proliferation of the volume of platforms that are collecting information about users, the volume of platforms that are able to place, access cookies and have unique IDs and create profiles of users that it really just got out of control. So what happened starting obviously around 2018 was really when the tides really turned. And we started seeing some of those regulatory pieces of legislation that were introducing restrictions on data collection and data capture and how we could use information. Now, what's really relevant for our conversation today is the behavior that started to happen around 2019 with respect to technical restrictions being imposed by various different browsers. And I say restrictions in terms of restrictions on what you can technically do with information in the browsers, but we could also look at them as protections for users starting to be implemented in a technical manner within users' browsers. So it started with Safari and ITP back in February 2019. And then the big one that impacts the largest segment of the industry, given that there is a little over 63% adoption of the Google Chrome browser, was the announcement in February of last year that Chrome has the intention of phasing out third-party cookies within the next 2 years. And that was in 2020. So by 2022, Chrome phasing out support for third-party cookies. And that's really what we want to dig into here today is the progress that Chrome is making with that stated intention and some of the replacements that are being introduced for cookies. So first, just so we're all on the same page, I want to do a quick overview and a definition review. So we're going to use a lot of these different terms kind of, well, not interchangeably. We will use these terms throughout our discussion here today. So want to make sure that everyone is aware of exactly what we're talking about. So the first thing that we'll mention here is tags. When we talk about tags or pixels, we're talking about the methods via which data is being collected on a website. So tags are JavaScript code that run on a website. They're the mechanism via which both data is collected, but they're also the mechanism via which cookies are placed. Pixels are original tags. They're just little small image files that send a request or send data up to a particular platform. So they're a little bit less customizable, less mature, I guess if you could say, than tags. I want to differentiate tags and pixels though from cookies. Cookies are just the small text files that are placed on a user's browser. Cookies are used to save or store information on the user's browser for later reference. So there is that distinction between tags, which are the mechanism via which data is collected and via which cookies are placed and cookies are read, whereas cookies themselves, which are the small text files that are placed and used to store information for later. Now, cookies fall into two different types of contexts. We have first-party cookies, which are cookies that are set on the domain in which you are visiting, the top-level domain. So if I'm on infotrust.com, any first-party cookie is going to be a cookie that is set on infotrust.com versus third-party cookies, which are any cookie that is placed or set on a domain that is outside of that top-level domain that I am on. So the domain that is in the browser bar, if a cookie is set on a different domain, then it is a third-party cookie. This is a really important distinction because the thing that is going away is, in the Chrome context, is third-party cookies. Removing support for third-party cookies, the concept of first-party cookies remains, and that is true across all of the various different browsers. I see a question here just about February 22 on the previous slide. 2022 is the stated intention. February of 2020 was simply when the announcement was made that the intention was to phase out within 2 years. So there is no hard deadline of February 2022 of when these different restrictions that we'll talk about go into place. It's a good question, and yeah, quick clarification for that. So these are the definitions and what we'll be talking about: tags, pixels, cookies, and then that distinction between first party and third party. So again, for third party cookies, really to drive this home, cookies are set on a domain that is not the domain of the page being viewed. It's a simple way of thinking about it. What is special about these third-party cookies and what kind of differentiates them is that they are able to be read across different domains. So what they're often used for is to store a unique identifier. So an ID that is associated with that particular browser and through as an extension associated with that particular user. So this ID is used as a key value to represent the user, and then that key value is used to join data sets across different websites and associate browsing behavior across different domains with that one particular user. So this is where those two concepts, one, the fact that it's readable across different domains, and then the fact that it is unique to the browser and can be used as that key, those two concepts really converge, and that drives that power and the potential of what can be done with third-party cookies. I can observe users' browsing behavior across different domains, and then I can link that behavior together using an ID that is stored within a third-party cookie. So common use cases and what really relies today in the advertising and marketing technology spaces as it relates to third-party cookies. The first one is conversion attribution. Because there is that key that I can collect when a user views an ad, so when an impression happens, regardless of if they click or not, I can associate that impression with that third-party cookie ID. When that user then on another website clicks on an ad and enters into my website, I again can associate that click action with the ID that is stored in that third-party cookie, and then attribute that back and associate that back or correlate it back to the user. Finally, when that user purchases something or converts on your website, again, that action can be associated with that third-party cookie ID, which is stored in that third-party cookie on the user's browser. So now I have multiple different actions, all associated with the same ID, which that ID is stored in that third-party cookie. And I can use that to correlate those actions together by that same user and then provide attribution for that conversion back to those previous browsing behaviors. So that's where the third-party cookie ID really plays in there. Same idea, this same kind of concept can be used for cross-site measurement. So to measure ad reach, how many impressions are happening for a given ad across various different websites. I can use those IDs for ad targeting and personalization, creating those profiles of users across various different websites and their actions across different pages in order to create that profile and then target against it. Again, using that third-party cookie ID is the method via which I'm targeting that particular user. There's also use cases around impression capping, so limiting the number of times a particular user sees an ad, and then finally that user profile building. And that includes, for the user profile building piece, also the activity of supplementing any first-party data that you have with third-party data that you maybe purchase or combine from another source. So those are common use cases that rely on third-party cookies. And as those third-party cookies are deprecated, these are use cases that need some sort of new solution in order to be able to solve for. Now, what to provide just one super quick example, and this is from this morning, again, just to highlight the core concept here for third-party cookies the IDs that are stored, and then associating that with those different use cases. This is looking at cookies that are set or placed on the Facebook domain. You can see here, I was on two separate websites, Adidas and then Nike, and we can see there is a similar cookie in the exact same ID for me associated with my browser, saved to those cookies across those two different domains. So what happens is, in this case, Facebook is able to, because they have a tag deployed on both of these different websites, access or set, in this case, this unique ID. It's associated with me. And now they have, within their data set, the fact that this ID viewed pages on both the Adidas and the Nike websites. Now, again, they can develop this and collect this information associated with these IDs across any website that I'm going to that has one of their tags deployed on it, which is going to be a lot. And then they can develop those profiles and target ads to me based upon the particular profile of my various different browsing behaviors. So this is where it's important. This is how those IDs are used. This is just a quick example of that. So we have all these different use cases. We have all these different things that are reliant on third-party cookies. Now, there's two different ways going about. So obviously, there are a number of user privacy concerns associated with this. And so the stated intention of all of these different browsers is to limit the abilities of organizations to track a user's behavior across sites and to create those profiles of behavior across sites. Privacy in this case, or upholding privacy, is just giving the users the ability to offer up their information to a party that they trust directly, as opposed to being able to be directly observed across multiple different websites and have that directly observed behavior create those types of profiles. So in order to protect that privacy, that's where these restrictions are coming in around third-party cookies, because that is the mechanism via which all of that activity and that observation is happening, or at least the linking together of those different activities. So you have two different approaches. You have the Safari and the Firefox approach, where they're just blocking third-party cookies. There is no kind of offered up workarounds as of today, not workarounds, but there are no offered up alternative technical solutions in order to be able to solve for those different use cases that we talked about that are reliant on third-party cookies in a privacy-safe way. The other approach is what Chrome is introducing, and why there is that multi-year kind of runway here, which is the Privacy Sandbox. Now, the Privacy Sandbox, just the concept of a sandbox, it's an engineering kind of concept that is a protected environment. And so you're able to do stuff in one place while not making a mess outside of that place. So what the Privacy Sandbox, the concept does is it allows personal information of the user to be surfaced and processed in one area, so within the sandbox, while restricting access to that information outside of it. So today with the third-party cookies, various different platforms are able to collect those third-party cookie IDs, collect that browsing behavior and the personal information from various different users, and then link that together within their own systems. What the Privacy Sandbox kind of proposes to do is provide an alternative mechanism where none of that personal information is surfaced and available to outside actors. All of that is just contained within one privacy-safe area of the browser where different operations are able to happen, and then different outcomes are able to be achieved in a privacy-safe way. So the Privacy Sandbox is made up of a lot of potential different solutions, technical APIs that are going to be made available within the browser. Now, all of these things at this stage are still proposals. And there are different aspects and different kind of proposals that are being put forth in order to solve for different use cases. So how I like to think about the use cases is really in two different buckets. So you have the use cases for activation, so for targeting and delivering personalized advertising to individuals. And then you also have the use cases around measurement. So those things like attribution, view through conversions, or just conversion types of tracking in general. So measurement in order to be able to measure the effectiveness of advertising campaigns and then optimize media spend. Now, there are a number of different proposals that are flying around to solve for use cases that fall into these two buckets. Today, we're going to focus on just four, kind of primarily. And these are the four that you've probably seen the most news about, because they are the four that seem to be at least getting the most community involvement, as well as moving through this proposal pipeline a little bit more quickly and smoothly. So for activation, we'll focus on FLoC, as well as the TURTLEDOVE FLEDGE proposals. And then for measurements, we'll focus on two different conversion APIs, the event conversion API, and then the aggregate measurement, or aggregate conversion API. Now, when we go through those proposals, I don't want to get super low level, granular, not technical. I want to try to bring these up a little bit to a higher level so that everyone can understand at least the concept behind them, and then what they kind of tried to solve. And most importantly, with some of these concepts, being able to pull out some of the key themes so that when we kind of look back on these different proposals, we can understand the different themes and what everything is trying to accomplish, so we can start to think about strategies and how we're going to need to be working within this new reality. So the first proposal, and it's the one that's gotten the most amount of really publicity over the last couple of months, is FLoC, which stands for Federated Learning of Cohorts. Now, the goal of this proposal and this solution within the Privacy Sandbox is to enable personalized advertising based upon general information about the interests of the user. So being able to basically target advertising at users or groups of users based upon things that we are reasonably believe that they are interested in, or users or groups of users that have similar interests. Now, obviously today, as mentioned before, this is done via profiling using those third-party cookie IDs, which not a privacy safe alternative. So how FLoC works is that all of that kind of processing behavior and the actual placement of users within these cohorts and the determination of the interest groups or the cohorts based upon their interests is all happens within the browser. So encrypted browsing data stored in the browser, and then it is used to place the user in an interest-based cohort. All of that processing, again, happens within the Privacy Sandbox, so it's not made available to outside users. There's no ability to track a user across domains. The only thing that is made available is a cohort ID. Cohort IDs are only made available once an anonymity threshold is met. So multiple different users are going through, they're browsing the internet. Encrypted browsing data is collected and stored within the browser based upon that browsing data and a lot of mathematical processing that goes in there. Users are placed within a cohort. Cohort IDs are then surfaced once a specified minimum threshold of users or of browsers are contained within that cohort. Once that ID is made available, it is then able to be used to target against that cohort ID. And you can collect that cohort ID as well for purposes of analytics and your own types of modeling. So instead of individual user IDs, what is available is the cohort ID, and there is that concept of users being able to kind of hide within the crowd. So anonymity through a grouping of individual users. Now, the current status of this particular proposal is that it is in active Oregon trial that just was introduced in Origin trial last week. And then some of the implications for marketing and advertising is that no direct user targeting. There is no one-to-one user targeting based upon a profile of an individual user. The targeting happens based upon the cohort that the user is in. Now, there is no kind of context for what specifically a cohort is interested in. It's simply the fact that this group of users are interested in similar things. That ID is made available, and then that modeling and all of that can be done using those IDs in order to be able to infer general interests and then target against those different interests. So that modeling, again, happens for optimal audience targeting. It's done for cohorts as opposed to individual users. And then again, personalization is going to be based upon those cohort IDs. So what to do, and this is kind of one of the only things, because this is a little bit more formed than many of the other proposals, in the fact that it is in active origin trial today. What you can do is begin to collect some of these cohort IDs for various different users, and then analyze your current audiences against these different cohorts. So you can start getting some different insights around what cohorts, potentially, as at least identified today, are my users falling within, and get a sense for how modeling and how you can start working with those different cohorts and building in, cohort IDs to analyses around effectiveness of ad campaigns, as well as interest kind of based things within your own data sets based upon and segmented by those different cohorts. So we can set up our first-party data collection architecture, at least begin to play around and test how a first-party data collection architecture can look like in order to include these cohorts in this information. A few questions here in the chat regarding specifically for this, and we can dig into these. So the first one, does a cohort ID have a lifespan? Really good question. There's a number of kind of nuances to the proposal for how long a cohort ID would last. A lot of that based upon those different anonymity thresholds, and then how frequently those would be able to change. One of the kind of concerns with this is if a cohort ID, for example, frequently changes for an individual, the cohort in which they are in frequently changes, that provides more that an organization could potentially collect and then aggregate together along with first-party IDs that they maybe have, to kind of more further infer individual kind of interests, and it poses some problems for anonymity. So there are different aspects of the proposal. Potentially, cohort IDs maybe will stay static across websites once that ID is accessed. So once you access it, maybe it won't change for that particular user, at least from what you're able to view. Similar concept that potentially they won't change for a long period of time. That's in flux still right now. So there is no good answer to that. We don't know yet, but we should, by the time this becomes fully supported within the browser, then yes, we'll have some better ideas around what duration will look like. Where are the cohort IDs surfaced in the browser? Yes, so that is also kind of an extension of the Privacy Sandbox here, leveraging some of the new APIs that are going to be made available for the sandbox. They will be able to be accessed there from the browser. Perfect. So the next proposal here to cover is TURTLEDOVE FLEDGE. This is another one around ad targeting, and also another one that I'm sure many people have heard about. The goal of this particular proposal and this solution is to enable personalized advertising based upon past actions of a user. So one of the huge use cases in the world of advertising for using third-party cookies is remarketing, retargeting. So how retargeting works today, we talked about those third-party cookie IDs. You're developing first-party audience groups based upon actions that users are taking on your particular website. So a user that adds a particular product to a cart, but does not complete their purchase, for example. You're able to, leveraging your first-party analytics, create a data set of the users that have done that. Now, what that data set essentially is just a list of first-party cookie IDs. How retargeting happens then is that you share that first-party audience group with a third-party advertising technology provider, where a process of cookie matching takes place. So there is a matching that goes on between those first-party cookies and then the third-party cookies that they have. And then you target those users based upon the third-party cookie IDs. So without third-party cookies, that process obviously breaks. So how do we still solve for that type of a use case in a privacy-safe way without that one-to-one direct targeting? That's where the TURTLEDOVE proposal came in, and then FLEDGE built on that proposal. So how this works is that as opposed to advertising, again, being targeted against those third-party cookie IDs, ads are targeted against interest groups instead of individual IDs. Now, the concept of interest groups, I know it sounds very similar to interest-based cohorts that we're talking about within FLoC, but these interest groups differ in that browsers are placed into interest groups based upon browsing behaviors. So before, it's a fully automated process. With FLoC, it's a fully automated process that happens just within the browser itself, linking together individuals with similar interests based upon browsing behavior, just what they're viewing. Here, it is an active activity in which a script runs and adds that particular browser or places that particular browser within an interest group. So say I come to a particular website and I view a product on my website. A script will run on that particular page for any user that is accessing that particular page, and it's setting within that browser an interest group that they're now a part of. That interest group could be for any users that view this particular product. Classic kind of remarketing there. Contained within that context is the group, the interest group itself, and then also information about what ads can be shown to that different group, some bid information, buyer information, a lot of different context there. A browser, stored within the browser are then all of the interest groups that browser has been added to, essentially as they're navigating different websites and taking different actions across the web, and that browser is being added into those different interest groups. So all of those are stored within that privacy sandbox area of the browser. They're not what interest groups my browser is a part of or is included within is not available. I cannot access what interest groups a browser is in, but all that information is stored there within the browser. Now, when I'm on, say, a publishing website and an ad is set to be served, that publishing website or the seller of that particular impression is able to also then input context around that impression and what they're expecting, as well as some of their own parameters into that same area within the browser. So context from the buyers for those interest groups, along with the ads that are associated with those interest groups, input onto the browser, stored in the browser, privacy safe. Seller then is inputting information about the impression and what they're looking for, also into that same area, privacy safe. Auctions for that, so that whole programmatic process is then happening in browser, locally on the device. That is happening to determine what ad is shown. So any and all personal information, as well as interest groups that a browser belongs to, it all remains in that protected environment. It is not accessible externally. So there's a lot there, really a lot to unpack. And that leads to as far as where the current status stands, is that there are many components to this proposal, and many are still kind of being technically worked through, as well as even conceptually worked through. When you read through everything within the proposal and the technical documentation, the bugs and things that are open, the different suggestions. There's a lot there. The goal, though, is to have a first iteration ready for early experimentation during 2021. So still in process, nothing really to play around with at this stage, but conceptually, it is kind of important to be able to pull out some of those themes. So the implications of like how this will end up working and the goals as set forth within the proposal is, again, no direct user targeting. No more one-to-one targeting of an individual user based upon their specific actions. We're placing them into those interest groups, and we're targeting against those different interest groups. We also lack, we will lack context around like the ad preferences, because all of that information is all contained within that privacy safe area, within that privacy sandbox. Some other kind of implications and changes here is that entire programmatic and that entire auction process happens locally in the browser, will not be happening within kind of ad technology servers. And then that interest information, so those interest groups cannot be combined with other information about the user, again, protecting that anonymity and protecting that privacy. And then there are some implications, we dig into this a little bit further, of the concept of an interest group owner. Any interest group that a user is placed into has an owner, and it does require you, as opposed to being able to just create audiences on the fly on the back end based upon actions that users have kind of taken in the past on your websites. It requires some more intentful planning of those audiences, as well as, at least in the current proposal, the ads that you would want to be showing to those audiences, because that context also needs to be included within the API call to place the browser within an interest group. So a quick question here. I know there's a lot to unpack there, but a question about a single device being able to be in one FLoC, but could be in multiple TURTLEDOVE interest groups at a single time. This is, yes, correct. Single device, there's separate concepts within the sandbox. So FLoC, they would be in one cohort, and then a browser would be placed in, and likely every browser would be in a multitude of various different interest groups, all at the same time. And then the bidding and different advertising products, basically, for how targeting of users could be offered for those different types of cohorts, as well as different types of interest groups, maintaining some of the diversity with the options that you have for targeting. So those are the two kind of most pressing, as well as in many cases most important proposals as it relates to ad targeting and being able to do personalized advertising. Now, the other area outside of just the activation piece is around measurement. So there are a number of implications, as we talked about earlier, for the deprecation of third-party cookies as it relates to the ability to measure effectiveness of advertising and effectiveness of campaigns, specifically attribution is really a big one. So I want to talk about two of the different APIs and different proposals here for being able to solve for some of those use cases that currently rely on the third-party cookies. The first proposal is the Event Conversion API. So the goal of this is to be a solution to be able to count and attribute conversions in order to optimize ad spend without those cross-site identifiers. So without the reliance on third-party cookies, the ability to attribute and associate or correlate conversions with the ad clicks and ultimately the impressions of ads that that same user has undertaken, I guess. So how this works and how it differs. So as opposed to all of the different activities just being collected within that ad technology platform and associated with the third-party cookie ID to later be able to be correlated together, this, again, all works within the browser itself. So when a user clicks on an ad, that activity is stored with a click ID within the browser. Those events are stored there. And then also, when a user goes to a website and converts, be that purchase of a product, be that submitting a form, be that adding a product to a bag, you're defining those conversion events. But conversion events are then also stored within the browser. The browser is then correlating together those different clicks and those IDs with the conversions in order to be able to create a correlated conversion report. Again, all within the browser. And then those conversion reports, the browser sends conversion reports with correlated click and conversion data on set intervals. So click information or impressions are stored within the browser. Because that same browser is also then converting later, that conversion information is also stored within the browser. And then those are correlated together within the browser itself. Batching happens, and then that is sent to reporting endpoints on different set intervals. So this is pretty far along. Well, I say pretty far along. It's pretty far along in relation to a lot of the other proposals, in the fact that it is in active origin trial. It has been for a few months now, and it will be until July 14th. There is also some kind of nifty demos that you can find associated with the origin trial and some of the documentation around this that can really help you conceptualize exactly how this works. But one of the things that is really kind of highlighted, I will say, within the documentation is that this current trial and the current iteration is just a first iteration, and many changes could be made that would change this approach drastically or significantly. Now, some different implications of this approach and how it's working is that, one, there's severe limitations for attribution models, at least for how it works today. So today, only the last click attribution model is supported. Weights are associated with any different conversion, but it's all or nothing. It's 100 or 0, and that is the conversion value associated with any type of a click activity on an ad. There's also limitations, at least for how it's working today, on the amount of conversion data that you can associate with a particular ad click. Right now, that's limited to only 3 bits of information. So more or less 8 separate conversion events. So an integer between 0 and 7 is the only contextual information that you can associate with a conversion. That means no context around like a transaction ID or a transaction value or products that were purchased, anything like that. This is done, again, to protect anonymity. And so there is a balance, and there are some open discussions about different ways in which more context can be added to the conversion reporting, while at the same time maintaining that anonymity and the privacy of users. And then as of today, currently only click activities are included. So the only thing that you can associate a conversion with is a click on an ad. General impressions are not included today, but there is an expectation for support for impressions in the future. The final proposal that we'll cover here today in a little bit more depth is the Aggregate Measurement API. Now, this is a proposal with the goal of measuring or helping to measure the reach of a campaign without, again, cross-site identifiers, and also as a method to be able to help with per user impression capping. So how this works is that the browser records and then sends encrypted records of impressions to a trusted reporting origin, so kind of a trusted intermediary. And then reports at that trusted origin are aggregated, and then once again anonymity thresholds are met, then that data is sent to reporting endpoint to be made available for use. This is, in terms of the current status, very much still in conceptual development. Goal here is to have an iteration available for testing via one of those public origin trials in the first half of 2021. So implications here: maintains the ability to report on general campaign and ad reach data. So it is an attempt to provide a solution for that particular use case. But per user impression counting will be limited. So the solution does provide some level of control, not nearly as much as there is today. And it's also still too early to make any firm assumptions for what this will look like in the future. Again, it's still in the conceptual stages. There's a number of things really in flux with this. A couple of other just interesting proposals to mention here. First one being first-party sets. This is another proposal that is in origin trial today. What it allows you to do is domain owners can explicitly declare a group of related websites as within the same organization. So it makes cookies readable across those different domains. So if you are a multi-brand organization, for example, and you're trying to be able to tie together within your first-party analytics data sets activities of users across different domains, first-party sets is potentially a pretty more straightforward solution to being able to do that, as opposed to having to rely on, say, CDP for that particular use case. There's also concepts of a privacy budget. This is something that is kind of being built into a number of the other proposals, which would be a limit on the amount of data points that are available to be collected. And this is just an effort to combat fingerprinting. And then there are a number of other proposals that are explicitly there to prevent covert tracking or fingerprinting, which really points to the fact that these technical mechanisms are being put in place. There aren't going to be really sustainable workarounds. The key is to create sustainable solutions and a sustainable architecture and sustainable strategies in order to be able to really survive and thrive within the new environment. So let's take a step back and kind of examine some of the themes that are present throughout these different proposals. The first one is the general theme of the concept of aggregation in order to maintain user anonymity. So we're talking about targeting against cohorts and interest groups and not one-to-one individuals. For the conversions, we're talking about aggregation of impression and behavioral information. And then that concept of anonymity through the crowd is something that really comes through and shines in a lot of the various different proposals. So really what this means from marketing and advertising standpoint is we can't expect the level of granularity that we've had in the past. And we need to really embrace that fact and start thinking about those kind of different solutions, different ways of modeling and looking at this concept of more groups and interest groups and cohorts. A second theme is that more functionality is moving to the browser from server-side black boxes. So this potentially means less customization approaches. And then also, again, as I was mentioning before, fewer types of workarounds. There's not ways, technical workarounds, there's not ways of really supplementing information from third-party data sources. It's all happening there within the browser. It's either fed in, or it has to be fed in directly in order to really be able to be leveraged. Now, there are some aspects of some of these proposals that have concepts of like trusted servers where you can get more information to supplement things like the TURTLEDOVE and the FLEDGE proposals for that auctioning and programmatic process. But really important to really think about it's direct information that is directly provided to the browser where all of that activity is happening. There remain attribution concerns. Even we talked about those two different conversion API proposals, and they're still quite limited. So attribution is really limited to directly observable data on your own property and last click models. So you can do attribution based upon first party data. So what you're observing, landing pages, query strings, and campaign information that's appended to URLs when a user is entering your websites, and then being able to kind of tie together different sources and different things that they're purchasing and different actions they're taking accordingly. But there is a really big limitation on being able to include things like view through conversions or the just inclusion of impressions generally into attribution models. And that remains even with all of the different proposals that are on the table as of today. So again, multi-touch attribution across properties does seem to be something that's going to continue to present a difficult problem to solve. And then also this concept of purpose-built solutions instead of one solution with multiple applications. So we talked about third-party cookies and third-party IDs and how it's used across a number of different solutions. In this case, you have specific solutions and specific technical approaches to each of the different use cases and each of the needs that need to be solved. So it's much more specific and it requires much more intent with the activities that we're doing. And then finally, the theme of the just closing of different technical loopholes. So fingerprinting, and again, the need for a sustainable, really durable architecture that's going to survive, or in order to be able to survive this. It's not just technical workarounds. So I know we only have about 8 minutes left here, but to get into the actions and some specific things that you can start taking away from this today and start thinking about as you're thinking about strategies moving forward. The first one is you really need to evaluate your current state and then apply and understand organization-specific impacts. So how we like to think about that is with people, platforms, and processes. So what are the platforms that are going to be impacted by these changes? Where are areas where you're relying on third-party data that requires those third-party cookie IDs in order to join that information? And then what types of targeting practices are you reliant on, again, that rely on those things? Think about the different people that are going to need to be involved as you make these different changes and how processes are going to be impacted, again, as it relates to third-party IDs and data, how you're joining that, how you're doing these types of analyses, all of that. But evaluate where you are today, really get into organizational specific implications. Number two is embrace the uncertainty. There is a lot of uncertainty here, and that's going to remain. As mentioned, all of these things within the Privacy Sandbox are proposals right now. Even the things that are in origin trials, they will be built upon, they will evolve. What's important is that browsers are trying to put forth sustainable solutions in order to be able to solve the use cases of marketers and advertisers while still preserving the privacy of users. So when we're embracing uncertainty, things that we can do, control what you can control. The one thing that you always will have control over is your first-party data architecture, the information that you're collecting yourself, and then how that is set up. It needs to be set up in a lean and sustainable way, but also a way that allows for different flexibility. When changes are happening and there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a need to test. So plan on testing these different solutions and have the architecture in place to be really agile and to be able to test different vendors, different new ad solutions that are going to be introduced that really leverage a lot of these new approaches. You need to be able to, both operationally as well as organizationally, really embrace those changes, run those tests, and have a really solid data collection architecture in order to be able to evaluate the effectiveness. And then finally here, setting cultural expectations. The one thing, even though you're not going to have answers tomorrow, tactical answers, but if you can go into, from a cultural standpoint within your organization, and know exactly what is impacted, know how it's going to be impacted, and know what options are available, or have that testing plan in place and be able to put forth that plan for this is how we're going to address that uncertainty, creating that roadmap for testing and migration to these new approaches, having that confidence and having that kind of everything really laid out and organized is going to confer confidence from the organization. And you're going to be able to really set that cultural expectation that we don't know what the end result is going to be, but we're ready to attack it and get there. But that's really important as we kind of approach here. And then finally, strategy is key. Again, those purpose-specific solutions, they require intentful application and planning. define exactly what it is that you're working towards, and then test these different options as they become available, test different solutions that leverage these different options as they become available, and have that architecture in place to be able to successfully do so. Last thing that I'll mention here, stay on top of developments. Stuff's changing all the time. Changes weekly, changes monthly. Different browsers are having different approaches. We talked today about the Privacy Sandbox within Chrome. Safari's putting forth different types of solutions. More or less over time, I think things will coalesce. But as it stands today, be aware of what these different approaches are, be aware of the implications for your organization, and lean on partners. Different advertising technology partners that you're working with, data consulting partners such as InfoTrust, Tag Inspector, lean on them for organization, but also hold them accountable. Have a baseline level of understanding of what's going on, and be able to kind of really see through the fog that often comes. There's going to be a lot of new solutions, going to be a lot of new things really pitched to many organizations. You need to make sure that the backbone is really sturdy, and again, that they're durable solutions and not just workarounds. So those are specific actions. One thing here as we get into the Q&A, and I will jump into some of the questions that are still outstanding. If you're interested in more of a deep dive of these specific concepts and really the cookieless environment overall and some of those actions that we talked about for your organization, we do have a privacy-driven marketing workshop that is available. There are 3 different components to that. There's an education piece, there's an assessment where we'll work through with kind of your current state, and then there's also an opportunity for some of the strategic development. So creating that roadmap, some of those actions and activities that you can take moving forward. So that is an option. Let us know if you are interested in that. And then finally, we'll get into Q&A here in the last couple of minutes. So a question under TURTLEDOVE: how will the brand have access to interest group ID in order to target this group? The interest group ID, the brand will not have access to that. So under the TURTLEDOVE and FLEDGE proposal, a browser, you place a browser, the brand places a browser within that interest group. So it essentially assigns an interest group within that browser, along with add context information and then bid information. The browser is based upon inputs from the seller. So whoever is selling that impression, around who it is that they want to allow to bid and different parameters. The browser takes care of all of that logic. And so you do have some abilities. Again, there's that whole kind of trusted server model that's being worked through where you can put in additional kind of context, but there is no like interest group ID that you have access to. It's all just kind of general parameter type of information. But excellent question. Another question here. So should we be setting up server-side connectors with our vendors rather than just client-side integrations? In a longer-term approach, I would say yes, that is a good idea. Server-side connections, though, for data distribution, helps with first-party data collection. And then as these concepts of third-party cookie IDs are sunset and go away, and targeting really coalesces around things like these interest groups and things like cohort IDs, then there is no need for any kind of like a syncing or a matching to take place. So longer term, server-side connectors make sense. They give you more control over what data is going where, as well as more visibility into exactly what's happening to reduce some of those privacy risks on your own owned properties that client-side integrations kind of open up at this point. But server-side types data distribution or server-side connections is not a kind of silver bullet cure-all. Solves certain use cases, introduces some additional complexities, But yes, longer term, I do think that that server-side data distribution approach is going to be the most common approach that we'll see. And with that, I know we're 1 minute over. I see that there are a few additional questions in the chat. We'll try to grab these. I'll try to follow up just kind of via email on these different questions. Let us know, as always, reach out to us if you have any additional questions. If you're interested in the privacy-driven workshop that I mentioned, definitely reach out to us as well. I hope that this was beneficial and educational, and that you will join us in the future for future content. But thank you all very, very much, and hope to see you soon.